All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome. Today's presentation is on food and wine pairing, or wine and food pairing, either way. And this is for the Vidi 304 Wine Components class at Folsom Lake College. This is the presentation you all have been patiently waiting for. I am sure food and wine pairing is just one of the funnest things you can do if you're a foodie, if you're a wino, if you love it all, right? And that's because when food and wine come together, especially in a really intentional and purposeful and well executed food and wine pairing, it creates an experience where the result is greater than the sum of its parts, right? So it becomes a really fun way to enjoy, celebrate, and also, experience food chemistry in that way, right? So, all right, let's go ahead and get started. So why? Why do we pair wine with food? So pairing food with any choice beverage can enhance flavors and experience of any meal or snack, right? So it doesn't just have to be wine. There's lots of really wonderful pairings out there for tea, beer, cider, Capri Sun, whatever, you name it, right? Whatever that you like to consume or have, there's pairings that make things more enjoyable and fun, right? So it can enhance the wine and the food to make both more enjoyable or better than they were independently, right? So here I have a link to Wine Folly Food and Wine Pairing Basics, and that is where I got a lot of information from this presentation, in addition to Wine, a Tasting Course by Marnie Old, and other things I've heard over the time working in the industry, right? So here we are. Okay, so when you start a pairing, you really have to think about pairing food and wine just like you put together ingredients on a dish, right? So think of wine as an ingredient, right? So think about the flavors and characteristics it has. Is it acidic, sweet, tannic, light, heavy, etc., right? When we pair foods, even just foods together, we consider these things as ingredients, right? So if you had like a croissant or cheese or maybe even like a meat of some sort, right? We know these things because we consume them. So we can't really make a good pairing of food with wine unless you know the wine on that level too, which is why we spent so much time in this class going through sight, smell, taste, touch, right? All of these different components of wine to really understand the wine itself. Now that we know that, now that we have those skills, hopefully, right? It's always, and it's going to continue to be worked on, right? We're continuously building these skills. Now that we have some skills in that area, now we can actually really start to make educated pairings based off of that, right? So use that knowledge to pair with foods that you already know and love. So there are a couple different methodologies for food pairing. One is congruent pairing, right? And so this is where you have a beverage and a food that they share components and they amplify each other, right? So focusing on amplifying those shared flavor compounds. So for example, a creamy pasta with creamy white wine. So that'd be like a buttery Chardonnay, right? So I had this picture of this shrimp and then like this linguine and Alfredo sauce in this corner, right? So a very easy pairing and it's easy, but it's also very good, is a buttery Chardonnay with buttery and seafood, right? So it makes sense, or in like cheeses. The other methodology for food and wine pairing is contrasting pairing. And this is a balance of opposites or contrasting flavors that complement each other, right? So this example, you would have an acidic wine or even a tannic wine with something fatty or greasy, right? So we talked about in class that tannins pair really well with fatty foods. That's because these complement each other. The fat helps to smooth out the tannin in the wine. And also, if you had something high acid, something fatty would help to balance that out as well. So a contrasting pairing, if we're doing the same creamy white pasta, example, a contrasting pairing would be sparkling wine, because sparkling wine is typically very acidic, right? So that would be a very good pairing as well, just a different type of pairing. So you have congruent pairing using shared compounds and characteristics, and contrasting pairing, which is a balance of opposites, right? So both good ways to do it, but something to think about. So here we have another example, and this was taken from Wine Folly, and I just renamed for the sake of keeping things consistent in this presentation. So her example for congruent pairing was many shared compounds. So beef and mushroom, right? Mushroom is one of the things that contributes to umami and some of those really savory characteristics in dishes. Beef is also a part of that section as well, right, of savory characteristics. So pairing beef and mushroom together is a wonderful pairing because they have shared compounds and they will amplify each other. For the contrasting pairing, there are a few shared compounds, but they contrast enough to provide a lot of fun and interesting components to that pairing, right? So lime and coconut was one, right? So you have lime, which is really acidic and fresh, and then you have coconut, which can be kind of sweeter, nuttier, right? It's hard to describe what else coconut's like, but it's this contrast of characters that creates a really fun balance or dualism together, right? So they don't have a lot of shared compounds, but they contrast each other. Okay, next we have the taste chart, right? So tastes that will affect food and wine pairings. We have, fattiness, bitterness, sweetness, acidity, salt, and then we have spiciness, piquant. And so these are not the 5 tastes that we talked about in the tasting presentation. This is a much more inclusive, it's taste, but also texture with like the spiciness and the fat, right? Because these will interact with each other in the food and wine world, right? So we have smooth lines between these different components, and those mean that those are good pairings. The rough lines mean that these things do not go well together. So let's look at the things that do go well together. So fat, salt, and sweet definitely goes well together, right? If you have something bitter, it pairs really nicely with something fat or sweet, right? Where we see bitter not doing well is when you pair bitter with spicy or bitter with acid, right? So when I think about bitter, I always think about Brussels sprouts, like baked Brussels sprouts. And whenever someone has a dish that they love with Brussels sprouts, I feel like it's always like covered in maple syrup or bacon bits or something, right? And that's a really good dish, but what you're adding is fat and sweet and salt. And so it makes sense when you look at this chart why things go well together. You wouldn't take Brussels sprouts and add jalapenos to it, right? That would be a lot going on. That'd be bitter and spice going together, right? And then if you added lemon juice to that too, right? And then you have all 3 things that aren't really going well together. So I like to think of it on that way. It makes sense to me. However, it may make sense to you. Awesome. Whatever works. Okay. So here we have, kind of a visual of wine pairing taste components, right? And it kind of helps to create a space in your mind for this chart here about how, what the characteristics of that wine are, or that wine is, excuse me, and then what you're going to be pairing it with to help even out those characteristics, right? So the circles on each of these sections represent the leading components of these wines. So here first we see red wine, right? Well, for this specific example, it had a lot of bitterness, right? So this red wine has a lot of bitterness. It has some acid and little to no sweetness, right? So we think about what we're going to pair with this specific red wine, right? It has a lot of bitter, not a lot of sweet, and some acid, right? So in that case, we're probably going to pair this red wine with something fatty, something sweet, something salty, maybe something fatty and salty, right? But pairing this red wine with something acidic is not really going to go well, generally speaking, right? So that's how we look at these charts and these representations. We start to think about how these things would work, right? Here in the center section, we have a white sparkling and rosé. And for this one, it's very much acid-driven wine, as we would say. So a lot of acid, very low sweetness, and virtually no or low bitterness, right? So if we have an acidic wine, we could pair it with something fatty, something salty, something sweet, right? From there. But for acidic wines, again, spiciness, bitterness is just not going to necessarily be the best route, right? Then we have a sweet wine, so like a dessert style wine, or even a port. It has a lot of sugar, some acid, and little to no bitterness, right? So it's something sweet. We could pair this with something bitter, right? We could, pair it with something bitter like the Brussels sprout, example, right? Pair it with something fatty. You can even pair it with something spicy, right? If you want to do something spicy, that's great. And then much more there. So there's a lot of flexibility in that one, right? So just thinking about the wine that you're trying to pair in this frame can help you see like the big picture of where it's going. And then if you wanted to, this is kind of like the beginner's step, right? So this is like kind of like, I'd say this is more of like the intermediate part of food and wine pairing. If you wanted to get to expert level food and wine pairing, you would taste the wine, get tasting notes from it, right? Figure out what the sweet, bitter, acid components were of that wine and kind of discover, what are the overall characteristics. But then to go one level deeper, you'd get the actual characteristics of the aromatics of the wine. So say that you've, tasted a white wine and it had, basil. Say you got dried basil in it, right? Then you had a dish paired with it that either had fresh basil or had something that accentuates that basil or brings that note out of the wine, right? That's expert level food and wine pairing. And those are a really fun experience to be a part of. So there's different levels and we all, we'll learn our own path, our own speed for that. But that's kind of the progress of what you can look forward to. Okay, so there are 9 rules for general successful pairings, and we're going to go through these in more detail in the next slides, right? So this is kind of like, I guess you could call it like the scripture of food and wine pairing. So 1 is the wine should be more acidic than the food, right? Wine is acidic. So that's why we see a lot of like savory dishes, sweet dishes, cheese, all these things going so well with wine is because the wine is more acidic than all those foods, right? Also, the wine should be sweeter than the food. If you're having sweet things before tasting dry wines on the other side, right, it can ruin your palate. But if the wine is sweet, it's okay because the wine can be sweeter than the food, and then that can pair and it won't cover the wine, right? Another rule of thumb is the wine should have the same flavor intensity as the food, right? And this makes sense, right? Because if you have a really light wine and a really strong dish, it's just going to mow over that lighter wine that you're trying to pair with it. You want to have the same intensity so that way they can really dance and come together, right? Also, another one, red wines pair best with bold flavored meats, so red meats. White wines pair best with light intensity meats, so fish or chicken. And then bitter wines, so some red wines or even high tannin wines are best balanced with fat, right? So those are just really good rules of thumb. Also, it is better to match the wine with the sauce than with the meat, right? The sauce is going to be covering the meat, or if it's, a major player of that dish, it's very important that the sauce, if you're intending someone to eat all of that sauce with their meal, that the sauce goes with the wine, right? Also, more often than not, white, sparkling, and rosé wines create contrasting pairings, right? Because they're so acid driven. Typically, those are paired with things that have different characteristics than the wine itself, right? And it also goes back to the wine should be more acidic than the food. So if you're trying to pair, a really sparkling acidic white wine with something with lime zest, well, it could be a white chocolate with lime zest, right? That'd be really good. But if it was just sour with sour, it's not going to be a very fun pairing, right? And then last but not least, more often than not, red wines will create congruent pairings. So they'll create pairings where they have similarities coming together, right? So like the beef and mushroom example, right? If you had a Pinot Noir that had a lot of mushroom characteristics and you wanted to pair a meaty dish with it, then those are most likely going to work out well. You're going to see that a lot. Those are congruent pairings, right? Okay. So wine should be more acidic than the foods. We're going to break down each of these things and give you actual examples of what these pairings would look like, right? Okay. Oftentimes, a high acid wine will go well with something fatty. This is why cheeses are such a popular pairing with wine. The more acid the wine has, the more fat you should counter it with, right? So Petit Verdot, very high acid, very high tannin red wine, very good pairing with braised pork. You can also have braised pork belly and bacon, right? So this would be acid and tannin interplaying with fat and salt, right? So this works out really well together. For wine being sweeter than food, sweet wines will pair well with non-sweet things, right? It's okay if you want to do sweet with sweet, but oftentimes it just kind of becomes a palate fatigue where you're just tasting so much sweet stuff. There isn't really room for that contrast to come into play, right? So you want these things to play with each other. So if you have a ruby port, dark chocolate is always a really good pairing. Creme brulee is also an option. If you have a tawny port, caramels, right? So ruby port are the ones that are aged for a less amount of time. They have more fruit still on the palate. Tawny port is aged for much longer, and they'll have that caramel characteristic. So pairing that with caramels works out nicely. For white ice wine, New York cheesecake, lemon bar, citrus, floral foods would be really good, right? So New York cheesecake is a dessert, right? But if you've ever had like really good authentic cheesecake, it's more of that cream cheese flavor and less of the actual sweetness, right? So if you had a really good cheesecake, and hopefully I can convince Nick to make one for the final pairing for you guys. It's much more of the actual cream cheese flavor than it is the actual like sweetness. It's not that sweet, right? Lemon bars are sweet, but are super acidic, right? And then floral foods, that, what would that be? Floral foods. Potentially some dishes with a lot of spices and herbs. Maybe Indian dishes? We'll see. I'll get back to you on that. But yeah, those are some ideas for pairing sweet wines with non-sweet things. Okay, wines that have the same intensity and weight, right? So lighter wines with lighter foods. So a lighter acidic white plus a white fish with a delicate flavor, right? So if you are having like, you think about pho, all the lovely herbs that they give you on the side of that wonderful broth dish, right? You could pair that with a really nice acidic white wine, sparkling wine, right? There's a lot to be said about this, right? But you wouldn't go into, a pairing with pho with a really dark red wine, right? So that doesn't quite go together. And also, so that would be like a good example of lighter acidic wines with white fish delicate flavors. If you have a heavier white wine, you're looking at something with a white sauce or butter. And if you have a heavier red, you're looking at meaty mushroom, potato kind of dishes, right? So hopefully those are good examples of the different intensities of wine with the dish itself, right? Okay. A lot of people talk about how wine pairs with similar colored meats. This is a really good starting point for a lot of pairings. There are some exceptions in this rule, of course, but this is a really good place to start. So here I have a spectrum of all the different wines and what they would go with. So lighter whites, think like fish tacos, white cheeses. Heavy whites, like a buttery Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc, potentially, right? I wouldn't say Sauvignon Blanc is a heavy white, but it could pair with lobster. You have lobster with butter, right? So let's just say Chardonnay. Forget Sauvignon Blanc. That's going to be confusing. Okay, rosé wines. Really good with roasted shellfish. So like think seared scallop, light pastas, goat cheese. Lighter medium reds go well with pork, salmon, fatty tuna, lean meats, and even sometimes dark poultry. And then for heavier reds, we have fatty meats and cured meats as well, right? So you can get that charcuterie board, and it has all that salami and cured meats on it. Really good for heavy red wines, even medium reds too. Okay, bitterness. Bitterness and tannins are best smoothed out with fat and salt, right? Adding sweetness will help too. And the way I remember this is why beer and pretzels go so well together, is because the salt from that pretzel will help with the bitterness of the beer, right? So if you are wanting to pair wine with bitter foods, low tannin, soft reds, like Pinot Noir, whites, and rosés. Right, so that's if you have bitter foods. That can help smooth it out. Okay. Spicy. So we often get the question about what to do with spicy foods. And we've had some really good feedback from local winemakers and chefs. And what we see a lot is you can either pair spicy foods with something sweet. So a sweet aromatic wine, like even a sweet Riesling, Muscat, Moscato, can actually pair really well with pepper and spices. So that is an option. Also something fatty, so like a buttery California Chardonnay, or something salt. So Albarino or sparkling can work out as well in some cases. So it really depends on what type of spices and what dish exactly you're working with, but it is possible and it actually can be a wonderful pairing. That's for sure. Okay, so what it all comes down to. In order to pair wine and food together, treat wine as an ingredient. So that means you really have to know the wine. Make sure you taste the wine beforehand, know exactly how sweet or dry, fruity, earthy, acidic, tannic it is before throwing it into a pairing. Also, be creative and experiment. It's the only way you'll find out what actually works for you, right? Or what actually works for that wine. Like, we might be able to sit here all day and be like, oh, well, this generally pairs well with Cabernet Sauvignon, or this pairs well with Tempranillo, right? But it really depends on the specific wine. If you really want to nail down a pairing, you have to know both the wine and the dish and also test it before you present it, right? Cool. Okay, and that wraps up our presentation. I will get some student learning objectives added to this for you guys to prepare for the quiz. I hope it helped. I highly encourage you to check out the links in this presentation and also the Reading in Wine, a Tasting Course by Marnie Old. But this is really where the fun comes in for this class. So I hope you guys can experiment at home, have some fun, enjoy what we bring to class, and even apply it to meals that you make in the future. So awesome. Well, thank you guys, and I look forward to catching you next time.